We have with us tonight Chuck Wexler, who's the Executive Director of PERF. As you may know, the PERF report, which was contracted by the County of Fairfax last year, was issued just this weekend. And I know that it's a rather lengthy report. I'm sorry, frankly, that we could not have gotten it to you any sooner. I did have a chance to read it. I thought it was very professionally done, very well done. And I've asked Mr. Wexler if he might give us an overview of the report, perhaps for about 45 minutes or so, and then take questions and answers. Mr. Wexler, perhaps we could start by you giving us a little bit of background of your organization and your own background before jumping into the report.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and nice to be here, Fairfax County. So I'm Chuck Wexler, and I'm with the Police Executive Research Forum. The Police Executive Research Forum has been in existence for a little more than 40 years. We're a nonprofit independent organization. We created 1976 or so. There's 18,000 police departments in the United States, of which 90% of them are 50 officers or less. And the reason our organization was created was a desire to have larger cities, their issues represented. And that was what happened like 40 years ago. Because the cities like Fairfax County or Montgomery County or Washington, Chicago, and so forth, their issues are slightly different than smaller agencies. They're not better or worse. And the idea was that you would create an organization that would be willing to question conventional thinking, debate issues, and conduct research on itself. And that was back then. Today, we have done work pretty much all over the country and around the world. I've been at PERF for 22 years. I come from Boston. That's why I talk very funny. Need some interpretation. I went to school in Boston. Well, I went to graduate school there as well. I've been, as I say, at PERF for 22 years. In terms of the kind of work that PERF does, things that you'd be familiar with, the Washington sniper case, we were asked by the Justice Department to look at that case. We have been involved in, all across the country, whether it's selection of police chiefs or studies on use of force. We did the guidelines on tasers in 2005 and 2011. We just did the guidelines for body cameras for the Justice Department. We just did a report on the San Diego Police Department on their issues that they had out there. We've probably done 200 studies of police departments. We've worked in the Middle East. We've worked in Northern Ireland and Tanzania. But here tonight, we're here to talk about use of force. We just had a major meeting on re-engineering of use of force in Washington about a month ago. So we've really looked at use of force issues. We've written a lot on de-escalation, on dealing with the mentally ill, on all kinds of subjects that relate to this. So it was really an honor when we were asked to look at Fairfax County. I live in Montgomery County, so it's an easy commute to come here tonight. So we were asked to look at Fairfax County, at their policies and their procedures, not to comment on specific cases per se, but to look at the cases. And so that's what we were asked to do. I will go through the scope a little bit, but that's who our organization is. That's who I am. Do you have any questions at this point?
Thank you very much. If you would explain what methodology you typically use before going into your findings and recommendations.
Methodology?
The methodology for conducting a study like this.
Yeah, in every jurisdiction is different. But in this case, in terms of the methodology, it is in the report, but we look at a lot of your policies and the procedures, and then we look at the, we look at all of the documents that are given to us. And then we, like in this particular case, we went back 10 years to look at use of force cases, and we reviewed those use of force cases for 10 years. Not all use of force cases, but those involving deadly force. So we wanted to get a sense of what are the circumstances in those cases. We worked with the department to get, we looked at an analysis you'll see in here of all the use of force for the past, how many years? Like about eight years we have in here. I'll go through that. But I think you'll have a good sense of what your total use of force is by the department in the report. But our mission was very specific. It was to look at policies and procedures and to compare them to other departments in the country and to best practices. And so that's what we did. That was sort of the overall goal. As I say, it's different from looking at and specific cases and commenting on cases. We did not do that. We were looking for how does Fairfax County compare to the rest of the country, number one. Number two is, what should Fairfax County do to be a leader in this area? They didn't want us to simply say, how are we doing compared to others? So you will see things in this report, quite frankly, that I don't think you'll see in any other report, because I think our whole thinking about use of force today is fundamentally changing as we think about it more, and we're fortunate because we do work around the world, we can compare it to other countries like Scotland and Manchester, and that's what we did in this report, is that how do they handle, not gun situations, but other situations that involve, say, edge weapons and things like that. Very different. So we brought that into this report. Ready? Okay. Here we go. Yes, sir.
Were you surprised by the lack of policy on SWAT? And has the ongoing process moved to fill that void?
Was I surprised that you do have policies on use of?
We don't have general order on it. And currently the initiative to address that void as far as that.
Yes, sir. My name is Tom Wilson.
This is my, sorry.
I'm with the Police Executive Research Forum. I'm the Director of Applied Research and Management. I've been with PERF for a little over 2 years, and my background is law enforcement. I retired from the Anne Arundel County Police Department, where I served as either the last few years as a patrol chief or the Administrative Bureau Chief. So I was one of the principal investigators on this. We did make a recommendation that they have a specific policy regarding their special operations, so their SWAT team, sir. That is one of the recommendations. We saw SWAT. We had an opportunity to interview them. We looked at their training and so forth. But you're correct. We do have a recommendation requesting that they have a specific policy.
I'm going to ask that questions now be held. We will have an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. Thank you.
What I'm going to do now, if it's okay, I'm going to try to do this in about 30 minutes, 35 minutes. I'm going to go through, if this is right, Chairman, the highlights of the report. Is that okay?
Please do.
Okay. So in 2014, Fairfax County contracted with the Police Executive Research Forum to conduct a policy and practice review of the police department. This report contains 71 recommendations. I'm going to break these down into about 5 areas to give you the highlights, and I'm going to go back and give you some specific areas which I think are important. Number 1, we recommend comprehensive use of force training. In many parts of the country, use of force is compartmentalized into different areas. What we're recommending here is that the use of force training be a comprehensive approach, that it be scenario-based, that it involve, for example, legal and constitutional issues, lethal force, less lethal force, crisis intervention strategies, protocols for better understanding the phenomenon of suicide by cop. Very big issue in the country, and specifically here. As we looked at a number of the cases going back 10 years, we saw, in hindsight, situations where police officers were pulled in and where individuals either consciously or unconsciously wanted the police officers to shoot them, to be quite honest. And so we think that that's a big issue, not only here but across the country. De-escalation strategies. The training should be holistic in nature, combining different topics in a single curriculum in order to more realistically address situations that officers encounter. We think that in implementing this, too often what we've seen, and we've probably been guilty of it ourselves, is you make recommendations for changes in policy, but you don't train people in it. And we think that's really important. Some departments will say we have to change, say, a policy of not shooting at cars, and they don't train officers in how to do that. So we think it's really important not only to make policy changes, but to accompany it by department-wide training. The new training should be provided department-wide to all officers on a one-time basis and should be incorporated into existing recruit and in-service training. Decision-making model to help officers analyze situations. This is completely new, what we're suggesting, and this comes from England. And I'm going to let Tom Wilson talk about it because I sent him to Scotland just to give you a sense of it. Tell him about what this decision-making model is.
Yes, sir. This is a very different approach for us. We traditionally in law enforcement have had a use of force continuum. If the suspect does this, then we're able to do this. It's changed over time where you've seen circular use of force continuums, you've seen linear, almost like a stepladder as they go up. Some agencies use objective reasonableness. But the bottom line is in law enforcement, we've thought about critical decision making, but we've never applied it. Most agencies have never really looked at it and said, how can we apply it to everything our officers do? So we had an opportunity to go to Scotland and work with the Police Scotland. And what they've done in the United Kingdom as a group is they've looked at this process and they've designed a format, if you will, for an officer to look at really any given situation. It could be a use of force situation. It could be planning for a large-scale event. But it describes about 5 or 6 things, and it talks about, what is your threat? And is this threat at this moment, is this a legitimate threat? Is this a threat that's to me or is it to the public? And you sort of go around this diagram and you ask yourself, what's the importance that I act right now versus stepping back and acting later? What is the, if you will, the reasonableness of my response based on what exactly the action that is happening? And so they look at this and they use it as like a wheel, and I can go into it a little more detail later, but it's a wheel that they use to evaluate every situation. And they ingrained it into their police culture. So even at the lowest level where a recruit officer is going through a simple handcuffing routine, they're talking about this critical decision-making model, if you will, all the way to the chief of police using it on a large-scale event. So it's ingrained in their force. It's a different way of thinking about it, and it can be certainly applied to use of force situations.
Next big thing is we talk about recruit training, and currently Fairfax County teaches new recruits the mechanics of shooting in the first weeks of the academy. Firearm instruction is in 10 days, consisting of 80 to 100 hours of pistol and shotgun training. We think, and by the way, we understand why Fairfax County does this, and so we don't take issue with it, because the reason that they would do that is to see if someone couldn't handle those kind of situations. They would know immediately and not put them through the process. However, we're suggesting something a little different. Rather than start out with firearms training, we're suggesting that they change and begin the recruit training with the mechanics of understanding the most significant issues and concepts of policing. In other words, that they understand the big picture, policing in a democratic society, the mission and role of police officers, crisis intervention, de-escalation, duty to intervene, that they hear these principles first before they hear anything, and then that they get this other training. So it's simply, taking some of those principles which they might hear down the road and saying, these are the most important things to understand about what it means to be a police officer, and then they can learn these other things. But we think that they ought to hear that as the first things about what it means, the importance of policing in a democratic society, and the sanctity of human life, that they hear those terms first before they are given a firearm. So that's a significant change. And by the way, you'd probably find the introduction of firearms in most police departments in the country. It's nothing unique to Fairfax County. But when Fairfax County and the chief asked us to put together our recommendations, they wanted state-of-the-art. They didn't want to simply know what other people were doing. They wanted to know what could we be doing better. So that's kind of different here. The response to emotionally disturbed persons. We think this is a big issue across the country. We think it's a big issue here in Fairfax County. And that officers really get substantial training in dealing with emotionally disturbed people or the mentally ill. Now, the department is already doing a lot in this area, so I don't want to misrepresent that the department isn't, but we have some ideas on how that can be enhanced. And when you look at the incidents over the last 10 years, when half of those incidents involve people who may be mentally ill, it tells you that that's an area where you want to put a lot of attention. And again, the department's already doing a lot there. We have some ideas on how they could do more. We're also, in terms of officer selection, we're recommending that you create a selection review committee to include community representation. We think the community representatives should be a part of the process of selecting an officer, and it would be, and I think that you would get support for doing that. In terms of your use of force policy, we have a bunch of suggestions to strengthen your use of force policy by clarifying definitions, explicitly emphasizing de-escalation, specifying control tactics appropriate for different situations. Another important concept is this notion of creating a duty to intervene, is that in any use of force situation that other officers recognize that they have a responsibility if for some reason one of their other officers is kind of getting a little hot, that they say, hey, step back, we'll take over. That happens in a lot of situations where maybe you have a car chase or something like that. There's a responsibility for the other officers to help to intervene. We think it's important to, while they do a good job of de-escalation in officer training, we recommend that the department adopt strong policy language describing the importance of officers de-escalating tensions and confrontations when possible. For example, by calling for a supervisor. We know in a lot of situations, we've learned this in San Diego, that if you get a supervisor to a scene, a potential conflict scene, within 15 minutes, your use of force situations drop dramatically. We recommend explicit policy against officers shooting at or from a moving vehicle. If I could make one recommendation, to your department or to the country, I would say do not allow officers to shoot at moving vehicles under almost any circumstances, except when there's, like, say, someone with a gun in the car. This policy was implemented in the New York City Police Department in 1972, and it resulted in a dramatic drop. Not a big problem here in Fairfax County, but it's one of the things that you can tighten up, is you're not allowing it. And, the whole issue of officer safety, to be honest, almost no cases in the country where implementing this policy results in problems with officer safety. If anything, it results in officers not getting hurt, because standing in front of a moving car is only going to get you hurt, and it's not going to stop the person in the car. So we're very strong on that. We've recommended that in everywhere we've gone. We recommend a change in defining when a use of force, deadly force, must be investigated. We think you should investigate all incidents where deadly force is used in the same way, regardless of whether the officer hit his or her target. So if an officer uses their weapon and it doesn't hit anything, you should still investigate it, because that helps you to understand what were the circumstances and so forth there. Okay. Policies on electronic control weapons. These are also known as tasers. We call them electronic control weapons. We've done a lot of work on these ECWs, as we say. So we've written policies on them for the Justice Department 2005 and 2011. We've done research on them. And basically what we put throughout this policy is to make your policy consistent with what we know about best practices. For example, restricting the number of times you can quote-unquote tase someone, because we do know that continued application of the taser will increase the likelihood of injury or death. People have died from use of them in certain circumstances. The company has put advisories out. All of that said, it is a good thing for your department to have. You should have them. They simply have to be controlled and used appropriately. And so we present a number of ways that that you should tighten the policy. For example, the risks of repeated applications. There is a limit to how many times someone can be tased, and then you should go to some other option. So we talk about that. We talk about prohibiting chokeholds. I don't think that's a big problem in the department at all, but we think, in going through the policies, that is one area which a number of departments have tightened up. We talk about consolidating your policies on police pursuits. And so that's the big picture sense of where you are. Now I'm going to drill down in some other areas and just go through it. I'm not going to go through all 71 recommendations, but we'll, some of the things we talk about sort of philosophically is this business of sanctity of human life and making sure that everybody understands we're talking about the sanctity of human life of both officers and community members both, that is very important. A lot of departments are changing their policy because they want their officers to recognize why they became officers was, the preservation of human life, and that they understand that as a guiding principles. Okay, the scope of what we're asked to do, I'm not going to go through all of that, but that is on page 11. Basically, that says what we were supposed to do. We're looking at hiring processes, use of force policies and procedures, assessment of training, recruit in service, policies and procedures as they compare to Virginia accreditation. We looked at how your policy compares to 10 other agencies around the country. We identified the positive aspects of your policy. We identified the areas that needed improvement. And we went on site and interviewed a bunch of people in the department, and we looked at a lot of data. You'll see in this report, I don't know how often that you've seen this information, a kind of snapshot of use of force over a number of years. We looked at all your written directives, organizational charts, and so forth. The other departments we looked at for sort of best practices were Anne Arundel, Cincinnati, Fort Worth, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Miami Beach, Minneapolis, Montgomery County, Nassau, Seattle. We looked at these different departments for different reasons. Some of them we looked at them because they're in this area. Las Vegas, for example, we looked at because Las Vegas just had a collaborative reform. And so they had the Justice Department come in, and we thought, this is what the Justice Department considers, better practices. Los Angeles, they went through a consent decree. That's why we selected them. Montgomery County, it's in the area. Seattle, they're going through a consent decree too. So there wasn't one way to do this. We try to get a cross-section of departments to see how they compare on your policies. We talked about this use of force decision-making model as a better model, a model as opposed to a use of force continuum, which is basically you expect an officer to try to figure out in a difficult situation what's justified, or even the objective reasonableness thing from the Supreme Court. Those are hard concepts to get your head around. We think it's better to teach them to think about, what are their options? What is the risk? Can they do this by themselves? Should they withdraw? And by withdraw, we don't mean retreat. There's a big difference. Should they step back and ask for help? In policing in America, the best part about policing in America is you have officers who are willing to risk their lives. That's the good thing. The worst thing is you have officers that sometimes put themselves in situations that are difficult. So we have to teach them that it's okay to step back, to ask for help, to get a supervisor. But it's a good quality when you think about it, that officers want to take action. They want to do things, and that's what you want. But today the thinking is that there are certain situations where stepping back, slowing things down, That's the big principle in these decision-making models, is slowing things down and getting space between you and the issue. There was a thinking in policing that there was this notion of 21 feet, that if someone came within 21 feet, somehow you were more justified in using deadly force. And what we've learned is if you can keep that, but that whole theory is ridiculous, and we've thrown that out. But still, in some departments, there's that thinking. So now we know that if you can slow things down and if you can keep that distance, you're more likely to resolve something without having to use deadly force. But that's a new way of thinking for many departments, and that's too often what we've seen in some of these situations is officers will get on the scene and immediately put themselves in a situation where they'll have no choice but to use deadly force. So tactics are a big part of this training, de-escalation, slowing things down, time and distance. And that's really what this decision-making model is. Anything you want to say on there, Tom?
No, sir.
Okay. Again, we talk about helping officers respond to incidents involving emotionally disturbed people. We talk about suicide by cop. It's a fairly, it's not a really well-known occurrence, but when we went back over 10 years and we looked at these situations where officers would respond, and there would be, some kind of, like a small knife or a screwdriver or a BB gun or something like that, and you try to ask, why would this person confront an officer who had a gun? Why would this person? And then when you looked at their background, you realized that they had some kind of emotional problems. And the only way you could possibly understand that is to think that these individuals wanted the officer to somehow to shoot them. It sounds preposterous until you look at it. And by the way, if we're talking about 10-year period, all you need is 1 or 2 every year to have 25 kind of cases you're looking at. So in the aggregate, it looks like something, but you wouldn't notice it every year. So that's why we think, being able to recognize this. And importantly, what's important in these situations is the role of the dispatcher. In a lot of places, spend a lot of time training dispatchers, because in situations we've looked at, if they get the kind of information out of the person, perhaps they're schizophrenic, perhaps, whatever the background, or they've gone to that location 30 times, the officer needs to be told that and say, here's what you're walking into. We've been here 30 times. This person, the mother says, their son has been acting erratic. They were off their medication. All of that information is important to be able to distinguish between, a person who's in crisis versus a use of force situation. And they're very difficult, but the dispatcher plays a key role, and that's why we think that dispatchers should be trained as well. We looked at national trends. We looked at your definitions. We looked at the accurate reporting and review of incidents. It's very important. Sometimes there's a tendency in police departments to have boilerplate kinds of reports, and by that I mean, every report looks the same. It's important for supervisors to kind of look at those reports and really take time to kick them back if they're not correct. We thought it's important to have policies that are open and transparent, policies, practices, and training governing the police response to incidents involving persons with behavioral issues, policies on shooting at or from moving vehicles, firearms training that moves beyond marksmanship. Too often firearms training is just about, can you hit a target? It should be part of an overall de-escalation process. Other concepts are, we talk about legitimacy and procedural justice, and the way you introduce those terms into dealing with citizens, very important part of this. Okay, and let me get into the use of force data analysis. So we looked at a 10-year trend, and the vast majority of use of force incidents, between 69 and 80% in any given year, involve use of hands-on on the subject. Now, a lot of you, probably think, geez, that sounds like a lot. Actually, what's happening in the country is a tendency for police officers not to go hands-on. And so, but when we talk about hands-on, it means trying to get control of someone versus using a taser or using OC spray or something like that, or a baton. So hands-on is actually a good thing because it tends to be a lesser form of force. Wouldn't you say, Tom? Would you explain that a little bit so people understand that?
Absolutely. So as you can see, some of the numbers and the trends here, and it was 2013 that almost 80% of their use of force incidents involved hands-on. So what that means is that the department is going to report any time that they have to go hands-on with somebody, that person may have an injury, or that they show a sign that they may have an injury, or they make a complaint that they have an injury, and so they're going to document that. That is a best practice across the United States. Fairfax is doing it very well. Fairfax is even documenting when they point a firearm at someone and use that as a threat of force. That is not something that you're going to see everywhere across the U.S., but they are documenting that here in Fairfax. So when you see officers make those attempts to use the lowest level of force, which is, I'm going to use my hands, I'm going to place my hands on you to get you in control, that in the broader sense, that's a good sign versus what we were seeing years ago, especially when the taser first came out, where officers were very quick to go to that taser. And the reason being is we thought it was a non-deadly tool, okay? Well, that's not the case. We found out quickly that people were dying and that incidents were happening all across the U.S., and it's not a non-deadly tool. It's a less lethal tool. You know, we don't expect it to kill someone, but it can kill someone. So when you draw that taser and you use that taser, you really better be thinking about the repercussions to that. Again, it comes back to, as we talked about in the decision-making model, you know, what is your action as a police officer and your use of force in proportion to the incident that you're dealing with. So obviously, if you're in a violent crime situation, your use of force may be very different than some 16-year-old that just tagged a street sign and is running away from you. Is that the place you deploy a taser and try to hit them in the back with it as they're running away? No, it's not. So we did address some of those recommendations here. So when you see that, you know, using your hands, that's not a bad sign.
And you see, if you look at, well, if you have the report, page 25, if you look at the hands-on, the number of hands-on, that's slowly increasing, which we think is good. If you look at ECW, that's the taser, those numbers are decreasing. You had a high of 191 in 2009. Last year, 2013, you had 120. Discharge of firearm, you had a high of 15 in 2008. And in 2013, you had 6. So, you know, it's relatively speaking, you know, if you look at Fairfax compared to other cities of its size, those numbers are, you know, very reasonable. What's the difficulty, to be honest with you, it's hard to compare these numbers to other departments because other departments don't keep track of this information. We're suggesting that Fairfax County make this information, put it on its website so that they can track it. You know, that their numbers are very useful, very helpful to get some perspective on this. I mean, there's other cities in the country that would love to have these numbers, but, you know, they don't have, you can't compare one city to another, too. I mean, you just don't have the same level of crime, the same level of conflict. I want to make I want to just make this point again. Because I think this is important. So we examined 25 officer-involved shooting cases from 2006 to 2014. In roughly half the officer-involved shooting incidents, the subject had a gun or a realistic-looking weapon, such as a BB gun or a toy gun. The other cases involved knives, swords, or no weapons. Approximately half of the officer-involved shootings over the 10-year period could be viewed as involving emotionally disturbed persons. So, you know, an officer arrives at a situation. An individual comes out with a toy gun. There's no other way to look at that than to think that this is a suicide by cop situation. But it happens all across the country. And for an officer having to make that split-second decision, it's very difficult, you know, to distinguish. But yet, I think the more we learn about this phenomenon, the more we learn about the call you have, the dispatchers, their ability to get the information, the important. because believe me, if an officer gets involved in a situation like this and has to shoot them, and they pick this up and it's a toy gun, that officer is devastated. Believe it, I mean, to think that they took a life because someone presented a situation, it's a horrible thing. One thought we had in terms of, constructive comments is it takes 6 to 20 months to internally investigate these cases. We would hope that the department might find a way to investigate these cases faster than that. We next go through the 71 recommendations. I don't have enough, I don't want to take all your time going through that. I think we've talked about most of them. We talked about officer selection and involving citizens in that. We've made some recommendations on those areas about selecting community members. We talked about the duty to intervene, talked about the sanctity of human life. A lot of this stuff is technical stuff for the department about defining what objectively reasonable is in your policy, about changing, using the term less lethal as opposed to not deadly. And very important, tightening the restriction on shooting at or from a vehicle. And I'll read that exactly because this language is very important. Officers shall not discharge their firearms at or from a moving vehicle unless deadly physical force is being used against the police officer or another person present by means other than a moving vehicle. Probably one of the most significant recommendations any police department policy can have. We talk about training on the use of OC. We talk about adopting the electronic control weapon terminology. We go from a device to a weapon because we do think that they are in fact weapons. And we talk about restrictions, a number of restrictions there. And this is important. So this is the kind of recommendation we made on your ECW. This comes from the work and research we've done. Personnel should use an ECW for one standard cycle, 5 seconds, and then evaluate the situation to determine if subsequent cycles are necessary. Personnel should consider that exposure to the ECW for longer than 15 seconds, whether due to multiple applications or continuous cycling, may increase the risk of death or serious injury. So we think these are significant weapons, but you should have them, because if you took them away from your department for some reason, you would see your officer-involved shootings would go up. So while we're hard on them, it's important to have them. They're an important tool for any police department to have. We think it's important to notify your hospital people after you use an ECW, because sometimes what happens is they're used and then someone might have a medical emergency. So it's always important to have hospital people evaluate it. And I think I'm getting close to most of the significant recommendations. We talk about scenario-based recruit training. And again, the department is already doing some of this. I don't want to make it seem as though the department isn't doing this. We're strengthening it. We're talking about begin recruit training with important concepts in policing. We talked about that. And also changing your issues with in-service. So in-service training is more scenario-based. I think, Mr. Chairman, we talked about discontinue use of the pit maneuver, and I think that's just about it. I'm going to stop there and take any questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to lead off with a question, and then we'll go around the table. It's said that policies and procedures is only as good as the commitment and the will of the leadership. And when I say the leadership, I'm not only talking about the chief of police or the commissioner of police. I'm talking about the lieutenants, the sergeants, the captains. In your communications with the Fairfax County Police leadership, and you're dealing with them throughout this report, I wonder if you could comment on their open-mindedness, their interest in implementing wide-ranging recommendations like you've put forth to make the police department a model for others.
Well, first of all, I've known this department for a number of years. I've actually been asked to be involved in the selection process. I wasn't in this last process, but over the time I have been, so I kind of know this department. And when we were approached to do this study, the marching orders from the chief and others were simply, we want Fairfax County to be one of the best in the country. And people don't hire us if they have got major issues, because I actually tell them, I say, look, if you want a rubber stamp, we're not the ones. We don't want to do it for you. So this is a department that wants to be better. This is a good department that wants to know how can we be better. And there's some places we work that we don't always get that. So I think that's important consideration, and I think you have all of the right kinds of people and motivation to be better. The suggestions we're making, yes, it will require a change in thinking, but this is a department that wants to be not just good, but one of the best in the country. So no, I know this department, but you know what? We came up with 71 recommendations too. So there's a lot of area to improve, but it's kind of like building on something that's already pretty good. Right. It doesn't really.
And we're on, sorry. To go back, recommendation 66 through 69 talk about half the incidents Fairfax County Police have been involved in, namely those with mental health. But it shows a gap that we had heard between the dispatchers and the officer being sent out. And I know Chief Rossler's told us he has a goal of making sure all his troops, all his officers, have this type of training, which is excellent. How do you solve that problem? How have you addressed that with other police forces, and how could you drill down a little more on your recommendation 69?
Well, what I would say, if everybody can hear me, what I would say is that's a very good question. And the Justice Department just had an agreement in Portland, Oregon, where they, it was kind of state of the art, because on the one hand, people say that everybody should be trained in crisis intervention training. On the other hand, they say only certain people should be involved in crisis intervention training, officers that want to do that. And so that's the distinction they made in Portland, is they said you should have this group that really gets intensive crisis intervention training. Not everyone's going to be good at this, but all officers should have some basic knowledge. So here what we're saying in Fairfax County is that you have everybody trained, but you have some subgroup that gets specialized training in the Memphis model, as you say.
Okay, let me follow up.
Okay.
So just take Fairfax County police officers work in shifts. Are you saying that an ideal would be to have a sufficient number of CI-trained officers across all shifts?
Yes, sir.
And to make sure that the dispatchers know which officers on that shift are CIT trained or part of the crisis intervention team, as I would say, so that when the officer goes out, we're sending the best equipped officer to handle that current crisis with somebody with mental illness.
Right. The challenge, as you can appreciate, is you don't always know what you have. It doesn't say this person is mentally ill. It light doesn't come on. So you have to kind of depend on your dispatches or the call history. In some of these situations, you know, officers will know, we've been to this address 30 different times, and here's the situation, and so forth. So, you know, it's always easier, you sit here, but for an officer responding who doesn't know all of the information, it's hard. And it's easy for us, looking back 10 years, to say, oh, this was this, but at the time, how was the officer supposed to know that this is a toy gun, that this is this, you know what I'm saying? So in retrospect, it's hard. But that's why, you know, if you train people to kind of what signs to look for, you know, I think that's really important, and recognizing what is a call for help, you know, what kind of behavior is different than like a violent person who's, you know, trying to hurt you. And that's not easy to distinguish for a 24-year-old kid, you know, who's a cop trying to make these split-second decisions, especially when they have this other training that we don't approve of, where that says when someone gets within 21 feet, you know, you can shoot them. So we have to, we're fighting against that thinking that would make people think you have to speed things up. We're saying just the opposite. You have to slow things down. You have to step back if you have to. And you have to not be afraid to ask for help. All the patrol sergeants in these situations are really important. Getting them to the scene. Even if you don't have a CIT person, a sergeant can help develop a strategy. So, but that's the new thinking. Does that help?
Let me apologize for the way the voice sounds. I'm so happy to see the Scottish decision-making model in here. I spent last summer at the University of Aberdeen teaching with a counterpart where we were teaching law students the difference in policing and prosecution approaches. And so I'm really familiar with this. I wonder if you could talk about or think about this idea of objective reasonableness as being defined in the United States in the breach, meaning where there is a shooting or a use of force, there's an investigation, and the result of that investigation gives us, you know, something to learn from. If an officer's done something wrong, it's objectively unreasonable. If he's exonerated, administratively and criminally, he's been objectively reasonable. And then from that decision, we train other officers. That approach doesn't ever give us a model at the beginning of looking at how officers are assessing situations, whether reasonable or not, in the beginning. That is, before there's a use of force. And I don't know if you could talk about that some, but I think that it's a fundamental difference in approach in training, and I think it's hard to wrap your head around if you haven't thought about it a lot. So if you could elaborate on it, I think it might be helpful.
Go ahead.
This is a piece that we talked about a little over a month ago in D.C. when we had chiefs together from all over the country. And what you're saying is dead on. You know, you have a situation where, you know, the use of force in the eyes of the law may be justified, but the tactics that led up to that would probably have a lot of police officers go, I don't think I would have put myself in that situation. So I think that's part of what Chuck's saying is, with this national decision-making model, is you start to think about all these things. So as you approach a vehicle and you make a decision to climb up on a running board of an SUV because, you know, you think you need to reach in and turn the key off, and then the person takes off, and then all of a sudden now you're stuck and you're going 50 miles an hour. Now how do you end that situation? The question is, why did I get in that situation in the beginning? So this model, and that's kind of what we wrote into the report, was that we think Fairfax can be at the front of this. I will tell you this. I had the opportunity to go to their training academy. I interviewed a number of their instructors from their command all the way down to the officers, even from the other agencies that work there. And what I saw was they're pushing very hard on a lot of these concepts. You know, the way you push de-escalation in Fairfax was very impressive. I mean, kudos to you as an agency. But at the same time, I heard the instructors having the folks think about that. You know, why are you getting into this situation? Is there something else that you can do. So you bring up a great point, and that's where we're going with this. We think that Fairfax could be at the front of this. We can learn from what's going on in the UK, where we can step back and go, do we need to put ourselves in that situation? Do I need to force my way through that door for somebody that's armed with a knife, that's suffering from a mental crisis at that moment in time? Doesn't mean they're always suffering from mental health crises, but at that moment they are, and do I need to push the situation, or can I step back? Give you an example. In New York City, this goes back to the dispatchers. They use emergency services on every call where they know that there's a mental health issue. In New York, that's over 100,000 times. The officers go to the scene, but they just kind of step back a little bit, make sure no one's getting hurt at that moment in time, and then they wait for emergency services to come in. So emergency services like a SWAT team. SWAT teams traditionally come in very slow and very methodical. They think their way through things. They look at a decision model such as this, and they say, why do I need to rush? It's a barricade situation. What's the emergency? Do I need to go in, or can I step back? Do I bring in negotiators? So that all comes back to that process. Can the patrol officer look at it differently? Can we get them to think differently? So I think what we're asking of Fairfax is, look at this model, take it to your recruits, take it to your in-service and say, hey, think about this. Before you step into that situation, go through it in your head and walk yourself through it and see, is there a better way I can do it? Does that help?
It certainly helps me. I hope it helps everybody. I just think it's an idea that a lot of people probably haven't thought about. I wonder if you've looked at, in this decision-making model, and I'm interested in, you saying you train officers on values at the beginning, the tie between police departments and prosecution, where the role of the police officer really is as the investigative branch of the prosecution, and how officers act in those situations as opposed to feeling more independent and feeling more preserve and protect, as opposed to gather evidence, build a case, hand it to a prosecutor who's going to praise me for bringing that kind of case.
I think it's a great point. We haven't tied that in from the prosecutorial end, but as we all know in policing, our role is to investigate that crime and to be fair and impartial and to then present what evidence and facts that we have. So I think that as they look at their policy, obviously we made a number of very direct and easy to follow, if you will, policies on ECW or whatever. But the bigger approach is, can we take this way of thinking and, just like you said, can we remind our officers what their role is in this situation? And the chief's got a great vision statement that we made sure we incorporated into the report, and just to think about it and make sure the officers are thinking, what's my role here in Fairfax? Is it a warrior? Or the other buzz terms that come out is that warrior versus guardian. Is my job to be a warrior? And if you look back since 9/11, it almost seems like our role in policing changed a little bit. Terrorism became this threat, or active shooters. All of a sudden following in 2000, we get all these active shooter situations in our schools, in our businesses, and we originally would stand back and wait for SWAT to come. And then we had to change that approach because the community had an expectation that those were their kids in that school, and that officer was expected to go in. So in some ways, we've had this change in culture over policing, and in some ways we need to get back to, what are we here for? And we're here to serve the public, and what is our role in policing, and we are one part of that.
You said that it takes 6 to 20 months in Fairfax County when you have a shooting? What's the national average? You indicated that Fairfax should have speed that up a bit.
I don't know that there's any national average. I would just say, ballpark it would be good to get investigation. I don't know that there's any ballpark, but I'm gonna throw out a number. It'd be good to have something completed within a year.
12 months?
Yeah.
You said that half of the shootings you've investigated in Fairfax since 2006 involved persons with mental illness.
Correct. Well, that's our assumption. We can't
You're recommending CIT, which I strongly support.
correct.
Lieutenant Colonel Tom Ryan gave us some very interesting statistics. 2007, Fairfax trained 30 officers in 1 year. 2008, Fairfax County didn't bother to train any CIT officers. 2009, Fairfax County didn't bother to train any officers. 2010, Fairfax trained 30 officers. So in that time period, they trained a total of 60 officers. Since then, they've sped it up. 2 classes, 40 officers, 4 classes, 40 officers, 3 classes, 40 officers, 2 classes, so 557 officers, assuming all of them are still there. Can you tell us, in looking at the shootings, did you correlate those with CIT to show us that CIT made a difference? How many of those shootings involved CIT? Was there a decrease once Fairfax started speeding up CIT and saw its importance? Or was it consistent on all those shootings?
Well, we did not correlate it. And remember, we're looking at over a 10-year period, so the occurrence is still relatively rare. I mean, you could have, thousands of interactions, and you have one interaction with someone who's mentally ill. So in the aggregate, it looks like a lot, and it is, but on a year-to-year basis, it's still a relatively small number. So I think, look, I think I understand your point. I don't know that we can answer it.
Trying to get a correlation between CIT, which I believe is important, and you're saying is important, and what actually happens in the field. Do you
Right.
have statistics that show how many shootings were avoided by CIT, or statistics that show if a CIT officer was involved in a shooting?
Yeah, no, I don't have those statistics.
Okay, thank you.
So good evening. Thanks so much for your presentation, Mr. Wexler. And just a side note here, next time you go to Scotland, I'd glad to go along for as a casual observer. As I look back at your statistics, primarily around use of force, and I want to cut right to the chase here, and that is use of deadly force shootings, if you will. I note that in the last 5 years, there were 22 shootings in Fairfax County, police shootings, if you will. And I note that in the last 5 years, the Fairfax County has total police-involved citizen interactions. That includes criminal arrests, traffic interactions, and service calls for service, are somewhere between 450,000 and 475,000 each year. So if we extrapolate those 22 shootings in 5 years, let's say 4.5, let's just say 5, we'll round it up. So for 5 shootings out of almost 500,000 service calls, how does that compare to other police departments?
No, I get what you're saying, and it is a relatively small number, given the greater number of calls for service. There's no question about it. No, there's no question about it. The numbers here are good in terms of comparison to other departments in the country. We don't have the accurate information that we need that would allow me to make a better statement on that, because departments don't necessarily collect this information, share this information. That's why we think Fairfax County should post this information, be a leader in this respect. But no, your point is, it is a relatively rare occurrence.
Thank you.
Just a comment to Mr. Early's point. The numbers are good, and I thank him for throwing that out there, but I think it would be inaccurate to ascribe that the department didn't bother to train anybody during those 2 years. And I'll defer to the gentleman on the other side if they wish, but it was my understanding that we used to be dependent upon our training was a shared resource. We had to get together with other jurisdictions to provide enough instructors to conduct a course, and that wasn't always possible. And it's my further understanding that the county and the department have committed the resources now to set up our own instructors so that we can sort of make our own rain and we don't have to wait for the clouds to build in neighboring communities. So for what it's worth, I do think that their commitment is good. It's just a question of how we went about it, and I think maybe we have a better way to do it now.
Well, you have 3 years and you have 60 people, 4 years and you have 60 people trained.
I'm going to hope that this is on. Oh, Mr. Wexler, I too want to thank you for your report. It's pretty comprehensive here. And I'm going to ask you a question based on what I have on page 85 of the report. And there, in one of the paragraphs, it says that PERF has found that simply changing policy is not enough to produce the changes in practices and department culture that are needed for true reform. Departments must be prepared to invest the time and resources to explain the new policies to their personnel and to train them in how to effectively implement those policies. In fact, you write here, that is what this final recommendation is all about. Now, my question on that is, considering what you know about the Fairfax County Police Department, do you have an idea that you might be able to inform us about regarding what kind of time frame you would anticipate such cultural change might be able to be achieved here, and what would be the approach to take to monitor the change in that culture which you've called for?
You know, that's a really very good question. You know, it's easy for me to say, for any of us perhaps, to say, you know, we need to change a culture. It's very hard to change culture, but it starts at the top. It starts with, you know, a willingness to embrace the report, and when certain things, like in Las Vegas, one of the things that they did in Las Vegas, which was very important, was they talked about terminology. They talked about the sanctity of human life. Now, that may not sound like a big deal to us here, but in the police department, using that kind of those kind of words, and that was a change from the thinking, the prevailing thinking, and it's understandable, would be, you know, we want officers to go home every night. Well, that's right. We do want officers to go home at night, but we also have an appreciation when that Las Vegas said for the sanctity of human life, that message meant everybody's life is important. And so that's the kind of specific things that a culture starts to change. Because that would be the thinking, because you had, tragically here in Fairfax County, you had 2 officers killed. 2 good officers were killed. Just doing their job, this madman comes in and kills 2 officers. So you have in this department a legitimate concern for the safety of officers. At the same time, there has to be this appreciation for the sanctity of everybody's life. So that's what you're dealing with. On the one hand, officer safety issues, legitimate, because you've had officers killed here, much like in New York City when 2 officers were killed here. On the other hand, you have officers that are expected, you know, to recognize the important role that they have in life or death situations. So culture starts with it starts with the chief, it starts with his or her people, it starts with sergeants, all recognizing that, look, you know, we have an opportunity here in Fairfax County to be a model for the country. And once they see that, you look at Los Angeles Police Department. LAPD had a reputation for years as, you know, a great department, and then something went down. Then you had, you know, Bill Bratton comes in, gets, you know, they had a Justice Department investigation, embraces it, and now everybody could be proud of it. Look at Washington, D.C. For years, it was, you know, was considered great department. Then it became, you know, they had, the Washington Post did a Pulitzer Prize winning story on use of force, and they changed their culture. You don't have any of those kind of problems here in Fairfax. It doesn't even approach that. But what you do have is an opportunity to make, you know, to get everybody excited about maybe Fairfax becomes a model for the country in some of these areas.
If I could, my question was more pointed to assume that these recommendations are adopted, taken 100%. How long would you say, or do you have a time frame where you could say, knowing what I know about Fairfax County, even if we approached and presumptively adopted all of these recommendations, how long would you think it would take to change the culture? And again, my second point was, or my second question was, what kind of monitoring would you recommend in order to see that the culture is actually changing over that period of time?
You know, I think, again, it's hard to measure culture. You'd have to, how do you measure what changes you have? But it starts in incremental ways. It starts with the right leadership. Then it starts in how your academy is. You know, the academies are very traditional. You have to get the academy to think differently. In terms of your hiring process, you get those community people involved. In terms of, you know, involvement in all sorts of parts of the department are important. But I can't tell you how long that'll take. Every department's going to be different. Here, I think because you do have an already good department, I don't think the leap is that far to go. I think you have a culture here, a very good culture here. And I think with some of the changes that we're suggesting, I don't think they're that challenging. I think that this department already is going in that route. And I think with the support of this group, and then making the department a little more open in terms of presenting information out, maybe on a quarterly basis or whatever, so you can kind of measure and see how things are going. And I think there's incremental ways that you notice change. I don't think it all comes at once, and I think it's a gradual process.
Have time for a few more questions, and I want to make sure if there are also, in addition to commissioners in the room, subcommittee members that may have questions as well. John?
Is that lit? I too thank you for your report, and I appreciated very much the tenor of the whole report, the direction of the recommendations, and I was impressed with the scope of them. Following up on the question by Mr. Klingon here, I think I read in here that there's been some kind of understanding that you guys might be staying around to help with the process of beginning implementation of some of the recommendations. Is that correct?
Well, not exactly, but what we have been asked to do is to look at a policy on making public when an incident occurs. We have received notice that we have been considered to this whole policy of how you make information public. So that's a second project we've been asked to do.
Okay, it's a second activity. It's a separate activity.
Yes.
Because it occurs to me that one thing that a service we might want to look into, in fact, is to have you check periodically for this monitoring, see where we are a year from now, a couple of years from now, maybe annually, where we are in terms of implementing these recommendations, and that might be a very useful service to Fairfax County as a follow-on.
Thank you.
About methodologies, and I agree with Mr. Johnson. I thought the report was very well done and a number of very good suggestions. In fact, I think they're all good suggestions, but I'll try and go quickly here. You indicated you looked at the 25 use of force or OIS cases since 2006. Did you have access to the full unredacted files in all 26 of those cases?
Yes, I think we did, right?
Yes.
Yes, we did. The only ones we didn't have access to is active investigations.
All right. Okay, that's fine. So you had those. And the rest of these are all about investigations. I understand oversight. Excuse me. I take it that you didn't read the scope report, and I guess I don't read it either, to include oversight functions of compared to other jurisdictions or anything of that nature. Is that correct?
That was us. You mean?
Yes, that was outside the scope of services.
Yes, sir.
Does PERF write on oversight issues, civilian oversight? You say you do reports on a number of topics. Have you written anything on that might be informative to us?
Well, we've written a report on consent decrees, on Department of Justice consent decrees. We work with the Special Litigation Division. We've worked in that area. I don't know that I would consider us an expert in that. We know a lot about it, but I wouldn't say that.
That's fine. I was just looking for resources. The last question I have, someone else asked about the 6 to 20 months. Were you able to learn the reasons for the 6 to 20 month delay? Was there anything that came out as to why that was?
No, I couldn't answer that.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
I did. Thank you. Sort of a follow-up and for clarification. I think you said that you have been asked maybe to follow up on a policy on to when to make information public.
Correct.
Okay, so I will forego my question. Thank you.
I just wanted to make just a couple observations. One on the kind of back and forth here that Mr. Early brought up as far as the timing and CIET. When you're talking about that time frame, I think it's very disingenuous to talk about any type of training program without mentioning it within the backdrop of the budget and the challenges that this county and pretty much the country was facing at that time. One of the places that there was a strong commitment to try and keep the numbers of the department up to meet the needs for service and the street effective. However, we did go through furloughs. The administrative support area and things like the academy were places that got hit very hard. I can remember going up there weeks or months at a time, and that facility was a ghost town. There were some times when we didn't even have academies training, and if we did, it might have been 10 to 12 just to cover critical needs due to retirements. So we need to think about, and if we're getting hit that hard, the Human Services Board was getting even hit harder. And the cuts that came to the Community Service Board and the like were draconian. And I think it's things that we're going to be suffering for years to come. And I don't mean to preach to you, but I know that's something that you definitely understand, but I think we just need to understand where we're training at.
It's important to know, especially for the board supervisor. I doubt you cut out firearms training.
Well, there's also strong mandates to maintain those through DCJS for the certifications.
All right, look, I don't, we have a lot of other people that would like to ask questions, and we have limited time. Sal, you wanted a question, then there's a gentleman way in the back behind you will go next.
Yes, I have a particular interest in SWAT, and I injected myself when I shouldn't have early on in this meeting, and I hadn't heard anything in this report that addresses SWAT and when it should be used. If you have any ideas about that.
What we looked at is we didn't, SWAT in particular was not part of the scope. What was looking at critical incidents. So we looked at their critical incident policies. We did speak with the SWAT team, and we did discuss and we made a recommendation regarding notification to ensure that they were properly notified of what was going on, of situations that may require their expertise, and that they're notified appropriately. We did look at their risk assessment, their threat assessment, and when we compared it to other agencies and other standards, they were on board with other agencies.
Just let me follow up with regard to that. If the only thing you knew about a suspect is that he was involved in vice and nothing else, would you say the use of SWAT would be appropriate?
Well, I think that's a very specific case you're referring to, and I understand.
No, just in general, because the current policy that's written, forget about cases. Okay.
I think you need to go through their specific policy, their threat assessment, and you go down the threat assessment.
But I'm just being
It doesn't
very
meet those
specific
needs.
with regard to use of SWAT.
Well, I would say, it's not so much what, in a decision-making model, you would want to ask a lot of questions, which would relate to the threat, which would relate to the background of the individual, to get as much information as possible. Whether it was vice or whatever it was, it really wouldn't matter as much as getting as much information about the level of risk and assessing that based upon, that location, all of the information beforehand, what that person had been involved in.
Yeah, but I'm being very specific.
Yes, I understand.
The only thing you know is that the person is involved in vice, and you have no other indication that he owns a weapon or any other of the obvious high-risk things. Would you say SWAT would be appropriate? If that's the only thing you knew?
No, I mean,
You're not going to answer, are you?
Well, it's not that I don't want to answer.
All right,
I
next
am-
question in the
I
very
am
far
sympathetic
reaches of the
to what happened.
what we would call center field. Would you identify yourself, please?
Try another one. There we go. I want to applaud you for the philosophical underpinnings of your report. They're remarkable, and they're encouraging. And I know that you're an organization of national importance, and it's good to know that there are people like you leading the way for all of those police departments out there if they're willing to listen. There's something important that isn't being said. We're here, all this brain power, all this goodwill and good intention is here because of a succession of failures and because of one particular cultural failure, the county and the department have a knee-jerk reaction when it comes to the release of information. They have a deep reluctance to air out their laundry. So, how do you change that? How do you change the thinking of the leadership?
I think there are people that want to change. I think that this commission will help push that process. I think, to be honest with you, releasing this report this weekend before this meeting is a good thing, right? I think you judge things incrementally. Putting these statistics on the website, I think there are people that get it here. I really do believe there are people of goodwill who want to change. I think what your commission is trying to do is very high visibility, and I think people want to make the changes you're talking about. That's my 2 cents.
Gentlemen, you've been very, very gracious. I think Chairman Bulova would like to say something, and then we will. I'll make a suggestion, and we'll move on.
Thank you, and I just wanted to say thank you very much to Mr. Wexler and to the PERF, and I wanted to point out that this study was commissioned by our police department before this commission was created. Because our police department was interested in examining what our policies were, if they were in fact the best for today, and if there were some things, knowing that there are some, there's always things that go wrong. There are always things that you look back on and think, wish we had done things differently. But realizing that we are a good police department, an excellent police department, but that they were interested in learning what they could do to improve, I think is really important. So I want to thank you, and I also wanted to thank the police chief, Ed Rossler, for commissioning this report. I think it's excellent stuff. I reviewed it online last night. All members of the Board of Supervisors received an online copy. And so we haven't had a chance to discuss it yet, but I just wanted to say that this is really good and really helpful stuff, and it's going to be tremendously helpful to this commission because it speaks to the exact things that we're all working toward and working on. So I think the subgroups, the subcommittees are getting to the point where they want to start making recommendations, and you've really given us some help as far as some samples of some recommendations that can be made as part of this commission and prioritizing some of those things. Let me just lastly say I really, really like the decision-making model that you've recommended, and it's a new thing, and I think it will help in preparing our police officers for how they react to different situations. So thank you. Great work.
Gentlemen, I realize that it wasn't part of your contract to come tonight and address this commission, and so I, speaking for all the commissioners, subcommittee members, want to thank you very, very much. I also realize that we could spend the next 4 or 5 hours asking additional questions. There are a lot of people, unfortunately, that would like to ask questions but will not have an opportunity to tonight. So I was wondering if those who have not been able to ask a question but would like to, if you'd be amenable to have those questions directed to the commission, and we'll send them to you, perhaps for your response in the future?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you very much.